and welcome to Buy the Book. I am your host, Joe Hebert, and I'm so pleased today to have with us Jerry Schroeder. Jerry and I have been friends for probably going on 20 years now, and
Probably.
we've done a number of things together. He's a multi-gifted man. We can get into some of that maybe a little bit later in the podcast here, but today we're going to be focusing on Jerry's book. It's called Godspeed, Being in the Right Lane, Chestertonian Guides for Preserving the Pleasure of Driving while Avoiding Dangerous and Discourteous Driving Habits.
Nothing like a simple title, right?
Yes, yeah, it's an informative title. It's also an entertaining title, and the book is even better, I have to say. I read
Okay.
the book years ago. I don't know if it was just when it came out or soon after. But anyhow, I can testify that as I've been driving over the years since then, it has gradually, I'm kind of slow learner, but it's been gradually affecting the way that I drive for the better. And also, when I was teaching my children how to drive, this book was a big part of that, which gives me a lot of peace actually knowing, that I can impart the kind of lessons that are in this book.
That's
So you
high,
can tell
high
from the
praise.
title that there's a lot going on here in this book. But before we dig into the book a little bit, Jerry, I was wondering if you could just kind of introduce yourself for the viewers here. Say a few things about yourself.
Sure. Well, I appreciate it, Joe. It's really good to have the opportunity to talk about this book. It's sort of like talking about one of your children, I suppose. You're just proud of the things you create. Um, well, my wife and I live in Moline, Illinois. We've been homeowners in the same home for nearly 40 years. We've been married for 41 years. Somewhere along the way, we were drawn to the Catholic Church about 20 years ago, actually, and Chesterton was a huge part of that transition, which we can talk about. And yeah, there's really not much more to say. I worked for the Alzheimer's Association at the end of my career for about 15 years. So uh, now we're just living a retired person's lives and enjoying ourselves. And I play multiple stringed instruments, and I'm right in the process of learning how to play the piano, as it turns out. So,
Oh, wonderful! Yeah, I was going to mention your musicianship if you didn't get to that, but
yeah,
yes, I was at one of your concerts very recently and enjoyed it very much. And
thank
so,
you.
anybody in the Quad Cities area, look for Jerry. Jerry, if you send me something, I'll put it on my blog
Great.
next time that's happening. So, we're also going to have a link to Jerry's book. And let me just mention as well that back in 23, the blog featured a talk that Jerry gave. Um, and I'm trying to look at the name of Why Angels Can Fly. That was the
Right.
name of it, Why Angels Can Fly.
Well,
So
we
there'll be
we
a
both
link to,
gave this. We
pardon?
both gave presentations that night.
Yeah, we both presented there at that event. And so there'll be a link also in the notes to Jerry's article, his talk, which was also on Chesterton and the virtue of humility.
Right.
So getting back here to the book, it's a book about how to drive, and a lot of it I think is also how not to drive, which is
Fair.
probably good given the general habits that seem to prevail on the road, especially these days. But in the introduction to the book, you frame it as also an exercise in Christian discipleship. And I'm
Hmm.
not sure there are many people, even devout Christians, who would necessarily connect those things in their
Right.
minds and think about how they are witnessing to Christ as they're driving. So I was wondering if you could just kind of walk us through how did this idea occur to you originally, and how did it turn into this book?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's somehow, I've always believed that being a disciple of Christ means that we should be as devoted to Jesus when we're making our oatmeal as we are when we're receiving the Eucharist. That every dimension of our lives is meant to reflect devotion to Christ. I don't believe in a compartmentalized type of Christianity. And sometime quite a while ago, I just started to notice on the road that a lot of people were not exhibiting what I would call Christian-like behavior, and including myself. And I started to wonder, well, why is it that we sort of separate driving from the rest of our lives? And sort of like, well, I can be a Christian in all these other dimensions, but I'm sort of exempt from that duty when I'm driving. It's out here, it's sort of a dog eat dog world. And what troubled me was that I began to recognize that attitude, not just in myself, but I would have conversations with other Christians who would talk about breaking speed limits and doing all other kinds of dangerous and risky behaviors while they're driving, sort of wink, wink. And it just made me wonder, well, what is it about driving that, why do we not apply Christian virtue in that dimension of our lives as well? And Chesterton became kind of an inspiration for me as I was looking for muses to give me some way to vocalize my ideas.
Okay, excellent. So you're thinking about this, and as you think about it, you're sort of turning to Chesterton. And so I'd like to kind of raise, this question about Chesterton here. Why Chesterton?
Right.
In your book, you describe Chesterton as, quote, the most Christ-like man I know. Of course, Chesterton died in 1936, so you didn't know him personally. So I'd like to sort of ask you, how did you come to know Chesterton, and how did he make this impression on you?
Well, that's really a kind of a wonderful story because it all began when my wife Donna, who was a huge C.S. Lewis admirer and I'm sure has read everything that he wrote. And I'm an admirer as well, but she's kind of just has a much greater devotion to C.S. Lewis, more so than most people I know. And of course, Lewis was heavily influenced by Chesterton and quotes him quite often in his books, his literature. So Donna just got curious and wanted to know, what is it about Chesterton? If I love Lewis so much, I'm I'm curious to know about his influences. So she found the book Orthodoxy, which is kind of one of his masterpieces, and read it. And after she read it, she handed it to me and said, "You have to read this. This is the most amazing book I've ever read." And I did read it, and it really revolutionized my life and my sort of understanding of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. And I think it was that there were other things going on in our lives at that time, but Chesterton for us became like the inspiration who kind of guided us through a transition. We were at that time in our lives, I would characterize us as kind of culturally liberal without any real convictions. We were sort of, we went to a Lutheran church for a while and we went to a Presbyterian church for a while, and it was sort of like the denomination didn't really make any difference. The theology just didn't seem that critical. It was all about, did we like the people? Did we like the preacher? And it was really easy to feel sort of conformed to worldly values because it seemed to us that the churches we were attending were conformed to worldly values. And we began to wonder, is that the way Christ really wants us to live? Well, Chesterton just sort of exploded that for us. He really made Orthodox Christianity sound exciting and appealing and not heavy and something to be avoided, but something to be embraced. It's the first time really both of us said, wow, I think we already had this instinct within us that we were missing something in our Christian faith. And Chesterton sort of was like this huge light that kind of guided us in a different direction.
Mm. So it'd be fair to say that Chesterton sort of piqued your interest in Christianity, the dogmatic aspects of Christianity.
Right. Yeah, he's got a famous he talks a lot about dogma in his literature, and there are numerous quotes where he talks about, dogma is not something to avoid, but something to embrace. And he uses as an example, sort of an illustration, he talks about church dogmas and church teachings being like a fence around a cliff on a high hill, and there's children playing soccer on the top of this hill, and the fence around the hill enables the children to play freely and safely. You remove the fence and they stop playing and they stop enjoying the experience because they're afraid. There are no boundaries that keep them safe. And that's kind of Chesterton's view about dogma. The dogmas are not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced because they literally liberate us and give us a sense of freedom and safety. And I think Donna and I were already instinctively drawn to that idea without even being able to articulate it. And Chesterton just put it into words for us.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful image, and
Yeah.
you quote that in your book, and
Mhm.
to me, it's so striking how, of course, Christ, says that we should be childlike, and with this image that Chesterton uses, he seems to be sort of explaining how, of course, we might think in modern culture of dogma as being repressive and
Right.
life painful and things like that, but
Right.
he says by using that image, he said this is what enables us to be childlike and playful,
Exactly right.
boundaries.
Right. And
And
I, you
that,
know, I immediately sort of equated that with the driving experience because I didn't see speed limits anymore and the standards on the road as oppressive rules. I saw them as liberating values. And it was an easy step to take to just sort of apply that to my own habits on the road. If I want to be safe and if I want to be happy, I embrace these standards and these rules. They're not meant to repress me, but to keep me safe and happy.
yeah, excellent. So that's one of the major maxims or themes of your book. If you had to break it down into a couple of phrases, I think one of them that you give us in the book is that law is liberty.
Right.
Right. So, how do you see that actually working in practice as we get behind the wheel? How do we come to appreciate that law, stop signs, stop lights, speed limits, lanes, and things like that is actually a matter of liberty?
Right. Well, first of all, I think just in a practical sense that obeying the laws and the standards, while they don't guarantee we'll never have an accident, we're much less susceptible to them if we're following these standards. So just in a practical sense, we're going to be safer just by following these rules and standards and laws. But I thought more about that in an internal sense that I found myself, and I think a lot of people who drive will recognize this, that it's so easy to get enraged when we drive because of the way we're always sort of bumping into one another and pushing and aggressing down the roads and all of that aggression and all of those misbehaviors on the road really create an irritation within us. The anger that we feel when we drive is not because other people are abusing us, but because we've lost sense of our own attachment to the rules and the standards of the road. So I found myself liberated in an emotional sense. I found myself much less, I'm a much less angry driver when I'm obedient to the laws than I am when I'm not. And I think unless you experience that, you may not understand about it. So for anybody who's watching this who finds themselves breaking standards and rules and laws, I would say just try it. Try not and see what happens to you.
Hmm. So you've found this to be a liberating experience.
Right? Exactly.
Mhm. Yeah. So I want to mention another one of the maxims that you give us in the book, which is drive with love.
Hmm.
So how does that come into it? Because that's another thing where we might think,
Right.
not just with driving, but with Christianity in general, that we have
Right.
law and dogma on one hand, but then we have love on the other hand.
Right.
How do those things go together?
Well, a lot like Pope Benedict's book Caritas and Veritate, where he's talking about, charity and truth are not separate entities, that they belong together, and that one without the other is incomplete. And I think that might be the most important part of the book, is that, it's one thing to be, I mean, I could become sort of dogmatic about my own approach to driving, but I also want to be charitable. I mean, there are times when people sort of violate my space when I immediately find myself judging them as a rule breaking, a law breaking citizen on the road, when in fact, I don't really know what's happening with that person. I really don't know why they've done what they've just done. So I have to turn inside and ask God to give me a sense of love for that person. And that's part of the liberation that I'm talking about as well. That title, by the way, uh, Drive with Love, I was with a good friend having coffee, and he had read the draft of the book, and we were talking about it. And he said, "Yeah, if I had to encapsulate your book, I would say that what you're telling me to do is to drive with love." And I said, "That's absolutely right. It's like being a devotee of Christ. That's ultimately the fulfillment of our discipleship."
Wonderful. So one of the things that comes up for me in thinking about your book and applying it and discussing it with you in the past as well is this particular dynamic, which is that I think often when we learn how to drive originally and we eventually somehow find ourselves in that position, like you were saying before, of, well, even though I'm a Christian maybe, but I'm speeding, I'm running red lights and things like that,
Right,
because we're kind of going with the flow, we're going with the crowd. This is how other people are doing it, and it seems like if we
right,
don't go along with it, we're going to be weird, or maybe even it could be dangerous if we're not
right,
behaving the way others are. But on
right,
the flip side of that is when you start, thinking about how there's a good reason for these rules, and I'm also bearing witness. I'm, first of all, God is watching, and other people looking at me are getting a message one way or the other based on how I drive.
right,
So then I start thinking, okay, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to be more cautious. I'm going to follow the rules out of love, as you're saying. But then, how do other people react to that, right? The
yeah,
people behind you, riding your
Wh-
bumper, the people cutting you off, and things like that.
right.
And this brings us, back to another law, which is not necessarily a rule of the road per se, but is a rule of the Gospels, which is judge not,
Right.
right? So how do
Yeah.
you see that? How do you see that whole thing coming together as you're applying the principles in this book?
Well, I think driving is a unique human experience because if we were, if we're in the company of other human beings in a gathering or around a dinner table, you're in one another's company. So these principles of judgment and mercy are sort of active in a face-to-face contact. The problem with driving is that we're isolated in machines. And so I think the challenge is greater because we don't really know what's moving the person who's just aggravated me. They don't know. They might be just as irritated at me for some reason, and I don't know that. We don't have any ability to communicate other than give each other the finger and honk our horns. You know what I mean? So that's part of the problem is we're in what I would call it, and I think I do say this in the book, that it's an inhuman environment. We're not really physically present with one another. We're in machines kind of trying to avoid one another. So I think we just have to be excuse me, particularly vigilant about those virtues and apply them in almost in an excessive kind of way, realizing that part of the dynamic is I don't know what this person is about and they don't know what I'm about, but I do know that it's my obligation as a follower of Christ not to judge that person and just to sort of stay true to what I believe, which is to conform to the rules and standards of the road, regardless of whether anybody else does or doesn't.
Wonderful. Yeah, one thing I want to mention, is that your book is full of so many beautiful quotations from Chesterton.
Right?
There's a lot of serious content in the book. I mean, you talk about their statistics, so they're just kind of looking at what's actually going on the road. There's anecdotes of your own experiences. There's even some very sad stories. You mentioned at one point an accident that took place
Mhm.
near your office, and a young woman died because of somebody running a red light.
Right.
Um, there's there's all these spiritual reflections, and there's a lot of, I would say, just reading Chesterton, there's always this kind of lighthearted feel to it, right? This
Right.
just uplifting, liberating
Right.
kind of feel of the way
Right.
that he explains the wisdom that may be paradoxical or may be hard for us to discern, not the wisdom of the world, but the wisdom of God.
Exactly.
Um, so
Well
it's
put.
clear from reading this that by the time you wrote this book, you were steeped in Chesterton, right?
Right.
You're just weaving things from all kinds of his writings. And so I'm interested in hearing a little bit about how did you get to that point? You mentioned reading Orthodoxy, and anybody who reads your book, which I recommend, they're going to get a lot of quotations that they can follow. They can kind of
Right.
see your sources. But what was the actual sort of path by which you came to know Chesterton that well? How did you do that, and how would you recommend others try to incorporate Chesterton into their life or any similar kind of thing if they're interested in other authors like that? How do we actually get to the point where we can have a wise, person like that
Mhm.
in our own, heads? We can sort of channel their wisdom.
Yeah, well, yeah, and you've read a lot of Chesterton as well, Joe, that he's not always easy to understand. So, it was probably not the best, reading Orthodoxy was probably not the best choice for me or for Donna because I've read it, I don't know how many times, numerous times. When you look at my copy, it's pretty much entirely underlined because everything ultimately becomes an interesting quote. But it took me a long time and several readings before some things became clear to me. So, had I known that in the beginning, I might have chosen something different. He's wrote a lot of essays, and the book that I would recommend people begin with is called Tremendous Trifles, which is a collection of essays. And many of the essays are just very colorful, humorous, beautiful, very accessible to most of us, and sort of work from there into his more difficult literature. Although I know a lot of people who begin with Orthodoxy or The Everlasting Man, which I would rank up there with Orthodoxy as one of his masterpieces, they're difficult to slog through. But the truth is, there's something about Chesterton, even when you're reading the stuff that's difficult to understand, he's got this way of sort of giving you the sense that you do understand it. And even if it's not crystal clear, you know that the next time you read it, it's going to be clearer than this time you're reading it. So, yeah, I think one thing for me, just reading Orthodoxy and becoming so enchanted by it in the beginning, led me to other Chesterton books. And yeah, we ultimately consumed, he wrote like 100 books, just thousands of essays. He was just incredibly prolific. It's unbelievable because he died before he was 63 years old. He didn't really start writing seriously until he was about 20. So in about a 40-year span, he produced more literature than any other writer I'm aware of. So it's pretty astonishing. And so you can't exhaust him. And even if you did read all 100 books, there's just absolutely no doubt you'd go back and read them again. So yeah, I think I just was smitten by him. And like any author you find that you love, you just want to go back and continue reading him. And it was obvious to me that his wisdom was so applicable to my ideas about driving that it was an easy choice to make to use him as sort of the inspirational basis of the ideology in this book.
Wonderful. So you obviously have cultivated this kind of relationship with Chesterton over the years, and you've also done a lot to share Chesterton with others. So could you talk a little bit about when did you maybe start doing that, what that experience was like,
Yeah,
and how did that play into your kind of absorption of Chestertonian wisdom and
sure.
wit?
Well, some people watching this may be familiar with Dale Ahlquist, who is the president of what used to be called the American Chesterton Society. It's I forget what the what it's called now. It's basically the same organization. And Dale, when Donna and I had just read Orthodoxy, we were, like I said, enchanted by Chesterton and so forth. We immediately wanted. It was right around that time where I was invited to do or I was given the opportunity to do a presentation at Com University in the Quad Cities. If you're a Quad Cities native, you'll know that every February, in the Sundays in February, is St. Ambrose still sponsors that? Is that right?
The last time I heard, yes.
Yeah, so St. Ambrose University sponsors these community university classes on Sunday afternoons. And I was so enchanted with Chesterton, I just decided, probably naively, that I was going to introduce the world to Chesterton. Anybody who wanted to come to my class. So I applied to do a presentation on him, and they accepted it. And in that process, I invited Dale Ahlquist to one of my lectures, and so one of those Sundays was devoted to Dale. And while he was in town, we invited him also on the night before, on the Saturday night, to give a community presentation at a local church in Rock Island. And so, we've set him up at a friend's home and went out to dinner, and he did a great, wonderful, inspiring presentation on that Saturday night, spoke at the class on Sunday. So we developed a little bit of a relationship with him then, and it was that Saturday night that after he was done speaking and we were getting ready to break up for the evening, I said, "Does anybody here have any interest in being a part of a local Chesterton society?" And a bunch of people raised their hands. So I said, "That's great." We set up a sign-up sheet and people signed up, and we got a few people together and organized this society, as you well know, because you were a part of it for its final years. And so Donna and I facilitated that group for about 15 years, and only recently disbanded. But so, yeah, and for a while I was kind of like a broken record wherever I went. I would just sort of anything anybody said seemed to stir up some kind of a Chesterton quote. So I was just sort of the obnoxious Chesterton person in the Quad Cities.
Well, maybe it wasn't so obnoxious. I
Yeah,
really enjoyed my time in the society and those discussions there.
yeah,
And in fact, we'll have to have you back on here, Jerry, to get into more specifics about,
sure,
some different works
absolutely.
of Chesterton and really dig into, some of the particulars of his wisdom and the many different, subjects that he covered and styles of writing and things like that.
Right.
But it's been a great pleasure being with you here
I
today,
agree.
and really want to thank you for being on the podcast. And before we close, do you have any final parting words that you'd like to share with the viewers?
Well, I would say give Chesterton a chance if you've not read him, and don't be afraid if you do read him and find out that he's really difficult to understand. It's everybody's experience. Even the brightest people sometimes are completely befuddled by his meanings. But don't let that stop you. Look for his colorful essays, his accessible stories, and allow that to draw you into his deeper literature. It's a treasure trove of it and a wonderful adventure.
Wonderful. And I'll just say again, Jerry Schroeder, author of Godspeed, check out his book. You will find tons of Chesterton in there. And if something in there strikes you in particular, that could be maybe your place to start with Chesterton.
Right.
So thank you so much, Jerry. And
Thank you, Joe. I really enjoyed it.
yeah, we'll talk to you again soon.
Okay.